I'm here to introduce Adam, who is an old-time friend of mine. We go back in the United States, participating in the American Youth Circus organization and other variations of that project that have emerged. So I know Adam going back, I think, to 2011. And in the U.S., there's the movement of inclusion, I think, started a little bit earlier there and in a different way. And I think it's interesting to see how it's branched off. So I wanted to take this opportunity with this convention to invite him here and share sort of his focus of inclusion, because I think it differs a little bit from the main concentration of the convention, which is all about like actual technique and specific methodologies, like tools, physical things. And Adam's working more in the direction of really good questioning, I would say, bringing up like helping teachers gain better understanding just about, I don't know how to say this, Adam will do a better job, but I feel his element of inclusion is really important and one I want to make a bigger part of our conversation, which is why I brought him here today. So thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, I'll just double down a little bit on Craig's description of my work. So my name is Adam. I've been a circus educator here in the US for the past 15 years or so, working with the American Circus Educators Association and kind of working in both recreational and social circus up through professional level circus. I was a part of the founding of a school here, which is the first US-based school that is a member of the FEDEC. So Circadian School of Contemporary Circus here in Philadelphia is kind of a recognized professional school now with the FEDEC. So my career has kind of spanned all of those things. And I'm right now moving into being a researcher. So I'm doing research with Dean Krelars as part of a master's program, researching physical literacy and the way that pedagogy, or how we teach, affects kind of long-term outcomes in both youth and adults. So the questions of not what do we teach, but how we teach it and how that is absorbed and what the kind of long-term and short-term effects are of that on both youth and adults. Dean has some really incredible work putting circus arts programming and circus arts methods of teaching into Canadian public schools. And so that is really kind of the direction of my research and my interest, is what does circus arts and what does circus arts pedagogy look like when we begin to put it into public schools, when we begin to make it deeply accessible in kind of a different way, right? So that is a little bit about my background and my work right now. I'm moving in the direction, definitely, of both doing research and being a teacher trainer. And so the work I'm going to talk about today is my work in how do we talk about pedagogy and how do we take things. I love Craig's invitation to this conference because I love Craig's work and I love functional juggling. What does that pedagogy and approach look like when we apply it outside of object manipulation? What do these approaches and ideas look like when we apply them to other circus disciplines, say tight wire or acrobatics? What do they look like when we apply them to sports like basketball or football or soccer? Can we take the essential theoretical approaches that are going on in the pedagogy of functional juggling, or accessible kind of individualized pedagogies, and apply them across the board to anything? What are the key aspects of teaching and learning that are going on here that can be pulled out and applied in other disciplines? Yeah. So there's the basic gist of what I'm going to be talking about today. But before we go too much further, I wanted to do like a quick hello, start my presentation and find out who's here and what y'all's backgrounds are and who I'm talking to. Give me a moment, and I'm just going, we practiced this earlier. I'm just going to share my presentation screen. Somebody give me a thumbs up if that is working now. Yeah, cool. And I'm just going to pop up this QR code here. So if you pull out your phone or other device, I'll also pop this, if you're on a thing, I'll pop the link to this in the chat. Part of the fun of of virtual conferences is like finding which of these tools works. I've used this one before and I quite like it. I'm going to go ahead and move the task to the next thing. So this is just a quick question, should come up on your phone or on your computer if you're looking. Of the disciplines or different things that you teach, right? And you just select each one as you go, and we'll kind of see who's in the room and what people teach. Of course, I'm at a juggling convention, so lots of people teach object manipulation. And teacher trainers, cool. That's great, Garrett, good to know. Hopefully this will be interesting for you as I really start to get down into it. Great, that gives me some sense of what's going on here. Next question, what ages does everybody teach? Are we mostly working with very younger folk or children pre-adolescent, or does anybody here work in kind of the upper ages? Yeah, actually looks like a pretty good spread. Nobody working with 0 to 6-year-olds. I can see that. And nobody working 70 to 100, fair. Looks like we have a pretty kind of normal distribution here. So this is a question that whenever I am working with new teachers, either teachers who teach or teacher trainers, this is a question that I find to be really important to at least think about, which is identifying some of the barriers that prevent you from trying new things in your teaching. What are the things that when you go, if you know, like say you come to the functional juggling conference and you learn how to use the juggle board, and then you go back to your regular context, what are the things that would prevent you from changing the way that you teach? Are there structural barriers, right? Like you don't have a juggle board, or you know, your boss or the person who owns your space doesn't see the value of investing in equipment. Or are there psychological barriers? Is it just quite scary to try something new in class and potentially, like, you know, fall on your face in front of new students? I think it's important to think about, what are the things that would prevent me from changing the way that I teach? Are there social expectations from either parents or other teachers or from other students that would prevent me from changing the way that I teach? I think that everyone kind of has a sense. And maybe there's nothing. Maybe everyone feels like they can, you know, change however they teach all the time. I think, you know, like we all imagine that scenario. What a great scenario that would be. Yeah, cool. Ooh, lots of people feeling like, oh no, I can try new things whenever I want. It's funny when I ask that question of, say, PE teachers in public schools or physical education teachers, or say sports teachers. Oh man, the answers are wildly different than this. I love asking this question to kind of circus and juggling folk, right? Because we're just like, yeah, I try new things all the time, right? Like this is not a big deal. I love trying new things. And I think that's an unrecognized benefit of most of our spaces, right? Which is really cool. All right, last little thing in our interactive, and then I'm going to dive into what kind of some of my work is. So this is a little board where you can just type in your thoughts. They'll show up on the board anonymously, right? If I was in person, we'd do this on little Post-it notes and everybody would, you know, go up and stick it on the board, but I found this neat online version of it. Take just a minute or two and think for yourself about what makes a class or a learning session between a teacher and a student, or yourself and your students, successful. What do you look for? And it can be, you can make more than one Post-it note. You can make as many as you want. I'll add a few myself. What are the things that define success in your spaces? Oh, that the class is hard to end. Yeah. That when you're done, you're like, oh, bye. Oh, I'm sad we're done so soon. Good. Yeah. I think that for me, this is more of a get to know you exercise for how are people thinking as we come into being teachers, and how do we frame success for ourselves? Yeah, this sense of flow. I wonder, an interesting question to me is how we identify whether or not flow is happening in a class. You know, is it by observing students? Is it by our own sense of flow? Is it by getting direct feedback from students in one way or another? I don't know that that's more than a rhetorical question right now, but as I get into the research of what effect are we having on students, there are two main ways that we look at whether or not something like a flow state is happening. And one of them is observed behaviors, and the other is self-report, right? So what are the behaviors that we associate with flow state? And then how do we help people recognize it to self-report it, whether or not a flow state happened for them in a class? Collective flow is the urge of inclusion. I like that. I like urge of inclusion. Yeah, the urge to reach out to other people. What an interesting thing. Okay, cool. Thanks for coming along for that exercise with me. I'm gonna return to kind of the presentation, but I feel like I have a better sense of like who I'm talking to and what everyone is thinking about teaching and where their priorities are. So some of the focus of my work is around this idea that most movement teachers never receive any training on how to teach in a value-centric way. Most circus teachers, at least here in the United States, and I think abroad as well, at least in the places I've visited, get what I'd call content training, and then are like, cool, I have my content, now I'm gonna go teach it and learn kind of by holding what I'd call a custodial view of teaching practice, that I'm going to teach people the way that I was taught, right? And so we do that even if we recognize that the way that we were taught is intentionally or unintentionally kind of exclusionary, supremacist, body shaming, non-inclusive, I'm sorry, right? This custodial urge in teaching is just very strong. And it actually takes quite a dedicated teacher to break away from teaching the way they were taught and trying to find kind of new ways of doing this, right? My work and my research now and kind of into the future is based on this idea that teaching beginner through high-level movement skills in any discipline is compatible with value-centric teaching practice, period. That whether I'm teaching an entry-level juggling class or an elite Olympic-level gymnast, the same pedagogies can be applied and they can be value-centric, and that we can achieve elite level skill without breaking away from kind of the tenets of value-centric teaching styles, right? This idea is based on both kind of my own observations of a shift that happens in circus spaces as we move from recreational and social circus into professional level training. That as kids are growing up in circus spaces, the pedagogies are very inclusive and are very creative and are very individualized. And as we move into quote unquote higher and higher level training and more elite skills, the pedagogies of inclusivity and what's the other word I just used? And creativity are lost to kind of this higher level. Now we have to learn real skills. Now we have to do real technique, right? It's time to let go of functional juggling and do real juggling, which somehow involves lots of very boring drills, and you have to do it in such and such a way or else you'll probably, you know, like break yourself or something. And I really object to this, right? I really think this is poor pedagogical practice that is endemic in our industry, and that it's time to kind of like really examine why we have that shift and how we can work to change it. I also believe that the pedagogies that we develop for accessibility are the appropriate pedagogies for most populations, right? I hate answers that begin to say something like, here is the answer, here is the way for everyone. But the reason I'm okay with it in this case is that pedagogies that are developed for accessibility emphasize individualization, which I believe is critical at all levels of technique and for all disciplines of circus and movement. That the way that we learn to move and develop skill as humans is necessarily an individual practice, and pedagogies that recognize that individualization should be carried through any population and kind of through all levels of technique. This brings us to some ideas about how skill progression and how movement progression are believed to function for humans, right? And whether or not we as teachers recognize it, a lot of the ways that we teach, or a lot of the ways that we as teachers have been taught, are based in some of these ideas about how humans learn skilled movement. So I'm going to just do a brief like moment on how we used to think skill progression works. And this probably feels very familiar, right? I have skill A. In this case, it's this blue square. We're going to call it the blue square skill. Maybe this is a 3-ball cascade. Maybe this is a back handspring, right? And the way that we have presented this, or at least the way I was taught, the way that a lot of teachers approach this is, okay, I want to create the blue square in my student. So I'm going to start with this much smaller square. I'm going to start with this little piece of the skill. So we have the blue box skill. And when I begin teaching it, I start with this little tiny blue box, right? Here's a piece of the blue box. And then as I teach, I'm going to present more and more pieces. And we move from this tiny piece of the blue box skill to a full blue box. And this is how we think skill progression works for a wide variety of skills, right? Whether I'm teaching blue box or pink triangle or green circle, this is how we do skill progression, right? Boop, 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 boop. There are a lot of things missing from this model, right? This model doesn't really consider the social or psychological kind of starting places of movement for any individual student. It doesn't consider the context in which the movement is being taught. And so a lot of the research and science behind how humans learn to move is beginning to say something like skilled movement doesn't actually get built in these nice little lines or these nice clean progressions. Skilled movement actually emerges a little bit more like this, right? That the speed with which someone learns to throw and catch is totally based on an entire set of their pre-existing conditions, which are not only their motor skill conditions, right? But also their psychological conditions, right? And the social conditions in which they were raised, in which they find themselves. I'm going to do a very quick example, which is the way that I would teach a 9-year-old, or the contexts from which a 9-year-old boy who plays a lot of soccer and football and loves soccer and football, the way that I would teach this child to juggle, to do a 3-ball cascade, has to be wildly different than the way that I teach a 9-year-old girl who has only had negative experiences of throwing and catching, and is actually, because of those negative experiences, very nervous about balls of any kind. These two teaching methodologies should be and need to be actually wildly different, because the way that the skill is going to emerge for these two students is wildly different. The skill is accessible to everyone, but the pedagogy, the approach to teaching the skill, is what can become exclusionary. If I begin the process of teaching from a place that doesn't include the social and cultural contexts that students are coming in from, right? Considering gender and age and all of the different aspects of a person, can we have a pedagogy that allows entry points for different social starting places, different psychological starting places, different motor skill starting places, right? As we look at the way we teach people to move and develop what we would call fundamental motor skills or fundamental movement skills, our approach to that has to be necessarily different, because everyone's starting constructs, starting places are going to be wildly different, and the way they move through a pedagogy is going to be wildly different. Yeah, this is all a little bit, I'm going to do kind of another example of where this comes from, is these two, this idea of skill progression being these nice clean lines versus this very non-linear process, is related to what, at least in the United States, we think of as skill acquisition. Skill acquisition is kind of the current/older model of how coaches and students interact. And many of us may still interact this way with our students, right? This is the default mode of interaction between teachers and students because of how we learn in public school, because of how institutionalized learning looks in many places. This is our student, or you, and you have a teacher, right? And there's your teacher, and you give your teacher money, and your teacher gives you a skill or some knowledge. This is a transactional social exchange in which you give me money and I give you a skill, or I give you some knowledge. This is how, whether or not we recognize it, we are taught to conceive of teaching and learning. This is how most schools that I know of still function, right? Is you come to the school, you pay your money, you give some time, and you expect to receive skill in return in kind of this transactional loop. And this has started to change a little bit because of the internet and partially because of COVID, right? But also because this method doesn't really work, right? Because I can't, as a coach, give you a skill. I can't just make you better at anything, right? This idea, I think, is starting to be supplanted and should be supplanted by an idea of skill construction rather than acquisition, right? And in this framework, the student and the teacher are certainly still actors, right, in the skill construction process, but they're both working together towards the skill, and they both bring different assets and different contexts to this construction, to this collaborative process of skill construction, right? The student probably still brings money. I'm not saying money's not part of this picture or shouldn't be part of this picture. There is an investment of money from the student into the skill. There is an investment of expertise from the coach into the skill. Certainly skill construction, and there's some very cool research and science behind this, that free play, truly unstructured free play, doesn't actually lead to skill development. Children and adults who are just shown 3 juggling balls won't spontaneously teach themselves a cascade. And even if they do, it will certainly take a longer amount of time. They might come up with some very cool things, but without the structure of experience, skill construction still doesn't happen. So the work of a coach is still necessary and still kind of vitally important to this. It's just not a straight line of the coach's expertise into the student's learning or skill construction. The biggest investment that both people make in this process is time, and recognizing that the development of motor skill is separate from this kind of transactional nature, that the work is being done by both people, by both the input that the coach gives the student through experience, through expertise, through different challenges, through different drills, through different whatever the teaching method is. This is a collaborative process that happens inside both bodies, inside the coach's body and the student's body, simultaneously as the skill is being constructed. I think this is a really important framework to begin to shift towards and to help our students shift toward as we want to change the social expectations of what teaching and learning look like in movement spaces. Teaching and learning in movement spaces shouldn't and doesn't look like receiving a skill as part of a transaction. It should look like in the space a kind of collaborative process between the different people involved. And maybe there's many students and a teacher, right? It doesn't have to be a one-on-one sort of interaction in order for this sort of construction to be taking place. So how much more time do I have? Do I have time to do the next thing I was planning on doing? Totally, great. So where my work and my research have kind of led me to is creating what right now, and this is the first time that I'm like talking about these really specifically, right? Is I've created some online teaching courses, right? That attempt to kind of bring these ideas down into the practical nitty-gritty, because, oh goodness, my slides are just going crazy. So the first of these courses, I'm going to do kind of a little bit of a deep dive into these 3 courses and let you all tell me what you think at the end and ask questions at the end. The first course that I created was called Alternatives to Traditional Teaching Methodologies. The next course was Motivation Through Culture, is how to create cultural spaces that are motivating for students. And the last one is Practicing Consent, right? Consent being an important piece of movement teaching as we move from beginner through elite levels, but certainly the cultures around consent that exist in the spaces for beginners and pre-professional athletes will have a huge effect on what consent looks like in our professional and elite level spaces, right? Without a grounding of good consent practice in beginner and recreational spaces, consent won't begin to exist or won't be able to exist in our more professional and kind of elite level spaces. And so it's really an important practice. Anyway, to come into a little bit of a deep dive here. So Alternatives to Traditional Teaching Methodologies focuses, I'm going to bring up the slides, but not read them to you. This is kind of who this is good for. I use this as an opportunity to create some pitch slides for myself. Alternatives to Traditional Teaching Methodologies introduces a pedagogical style called non-linear pedagogy, or task constraint based pedagogy, right? For some styles of movement, this is probably very familiar, right? Task constraint is when instead of telling a student, I'd like you to do this thing, I say, I'd like you to try to accomplish this goal, right? The difference kind of between linear and nonlinear pedagogy is the idea of what I call a movement template. What I'm not what I'd call, what the people who study this call a movement template, right? So there's a teaching style in which I present, here is the perfect overhand throw. You turn your body like this, you take your hand with the ball and you throw like here. And I want you to now try to mimic this idea of a perfect throw. This would be linear pedagogy. And this is how a lot of movement skill and a lot of sport and dance skill are actually still taught. The difference between this and nonlinear pedagogy is nonlinear pedagogy would say, here's a ball, and I want you to throw it against the wall from this distance. Now I want you to throw it against the wall from this distance. Now I want you to throw it against the wall from this distance. Now I want you to throw this different, much heavier ball against the wall from this distance, is creating, instead of an ideal movement template, what we would call a task goal. And having students experiment on how to succeed at the task goal, right? I see this in a lot of the functional juggling stuff that I've seen from Craig and from other juggling coaches. Is nonlinear pedagogy is actually, at least in my brain, pretty present in a lot of object manipulation spaces. And here's the second slide there. So this is kind of what this idea of teaching is based around. And can that same approach be used in different disciplines, right? If you teach things other than object manipulation, how do you use this approach? How do I use this approach to teach about tight wire? How do I use this approach to teach acrobatics? Can I teach a back handspring with a nonlinear approach, right? This is kind of the focus of my work right now, is bringing this teaching methodology into spaces that don't traditionally have it or use it. The Motivation Through Culture course is largely about creating cultural spaces and that are psychologically motivating. And what do those spaces look like? There's a lot of really interesting psychological research into what causes motivation, what is motivation, what makes people kind of voluntarily engage in different activities or behaviors, what are the things that make people seek out activity or different movement skill. Fascinating research. And so this motivation course is largely based in and introduces people to a theory of motivation called self-determination theory. This is a really prevalent theory in psychological literature that proposes that there are kind of 3 different psychological needs that people have to be motivated or that affect their motivation, right? These 3 basic psychological needs are autonomy, the ability to control your own involvement in different ways, competence. competence being the sensation of competence rather than like actual competence. It doesn't matter if you're actually good at something or not. You have to feel as if you are good at something in order to be motivated to do it. When you feel incompetent, your motivation begins to deflate. And the third one is relatedness. And relatedness has to do with social spaces and whether or not the activity that is being proposed that you're learning about is relevant to your life in any way, right? Do you get to see your friends? Are you learning a skill that is important for your kind of overall being, right? So this course goes kind of a bit deeper into how do we create cultures and teaching styles that promote motivation in students, right? And in teachers, because burnout, especially for teachers, can be a real kicker, I suppose. The last course about practicing consent proposes a framework for consent that is separate from the kind of prevalent cultural framework, right? The prevalent cultural framework is that consent is a legal concern in which I have to kind of like ask permission before I spot a student, right? Or I have to kind of check off these boxes to make sure that my students are consenting, right? And this framework fails to account for existing social power structures and norms. It takes for granted the idea that a student is willing or able to say no to a teacher. Practicing consent is, at the end of the day, about creating a cultural space in your classes where students feel not only empowered to say no to authority figures, but actually encouraged to say no to authority figures. And this is actually quite small social work, right? When I say small, I mean it happens in the tiniest interactions between teachers and students, between teachers and parents, between the administration of a school and the people who are in the school. Because the reality is that in most schools and most teaching situations, teachers or administrators have what I would call disproportionate social influence over the space. And that disproportionate social influence can either be used to encourage students to speak up about their needs, to talk about when they feel safe and when they don't feel safe, to empower them and enable them to say no when things are happening that make them uncomfortable. Or that disproportionate social influence can be used to encourage students to remain silent and obedient. Silent and obedient students are the ones who are most at risk when it comes to things like sexual harassment or psychological abuse. So how do we create cultures in both our recreational and professional spaces that follow good consent practice when it comes to the small everyday interactions that either encourage consent practice or discourage consent practice? This is not a course on the legalities of consent. Kind of a prerequisite for coming into this course is knowing that everywhere across the world has different rules and legalities when it comes to the legal definitions of consent, and that those should absolutely be observed in all of our movement spaces. This is more of a ethical, moral approach to consent, where we have to acknowledge the social power structures that exist in our teaching and learning environments and take them into account as we try to build good consent practice with our students. Those are the courses that I've made so far and where my work is at. There's a lot in there, and I wanted to, did I succeed in saving? I did, perfectly on time. I have some time just to take questions or have some discussion with everyone. And I also just wanted to throw up these two links to my work if you're interested in it, if you want to follow more of it. These are my courses that I was just talking about, and that's my Instagram, which is where I post kind of most of my kind of content. Most of the content of the courses actually at some point makes it onto my Instagram page, so you can kind of get most of my thinking around this for free if you want it. And that's it. That's the kind of presentation of where my work is at and where my thinking is at as it comes to what accessible pedagogies look like outside of just juggling, and kind of in more and more as we expand the ethos behind accessible movement to other spaces, right? Because the reality is that not everyone is going to be interested in any one discipline or any one movement modality. And so these ethoses, these pedagogies need and want to be present in all sorts of movement spaces, right? I think kind of my overarching goal is to begin to be able to talk to like soccer coaches and like hockey coaches about how to begin to teach in these ways. That's maybe a little far off at this point, but I can cross my fingers and hope for the best here. Cool. So that's me, and I want to open up the floor. I can stop the screen share, or I can leave it up if anybody wants. Oh no, my mouse is dead. There we go. Come on, mouse. Maybe I'll leave this up for a couple minutes and take questions or thoughts from people. Oh man, there was a lot there. I hope there's some questions or things.
I can transition here and just say thank you.
Give me a transition, Craig.
Yeah, I hope it's clear for the people who attended, how much overlap there is with what Adam's talking about and like the methodologies. I see functional juggling as the application of this theory. And I'm someone who studied education a long time ago now, but there's been a lot more progress and change. And I really value how Adam is able to capture all these ideas. Not just to capture them, but to target which ones are important as well. So thank you so much for sharing. And I don't know, I'd like to hear other people's thoughts as well. I don't know if maybe it's not that kind of presentation, but maybe we can have a chat, Adam. We can have a chat about these ideas.
Sometimes I find if you just stay quiet long enough, then people think of questions. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
We can start a conversation as well. I'm happy to.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, the other thing too is this is recorded. Like I knew it was going to be it's harder. Me and Adam have been having this conversation for a while because we're both focused on achieving the same goal, but like mine is very visual, and his isn't. It's more in the mind and how you approach. It's the invisible part of the teaching that Adam is focused on. But I think they're so important to complement each other. Like the ideas that I created with functional juggling is because I've studied this line of thought and I applied it in Circus. So if I didn't have that understanding, I wouldn't have developed the toys. So I think I like the idea of people learning more about this in our community because it gives them the potential to do this for every discipline. Is the hope I see. And I think it's going to happen more in the future too.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of our conversations, Craig, and a lot of what I think is really fascinating about the functional juggling work is how far and how quickly it's come, right? And if there is this kind of interest in, if functional juggling has this sort of reach and this much interest, I think it's an indicator that lots of teachers around the world are interested in these ideas and are thinking about these ideas. And I wonder, like, I don't know if this is true for the people in the room, but I think juggling and circus have a lot of overlap, right? But circus spaces, but juggling spaces exist also as their own community, right? And their own world. And we're seeing that with other circus disciplines as well, right? Like the aerial community, right? Yeah. The acrobatics, the partner acrobatics community.
There is in the internet and everything, the easier it is for us to build specialization.
Yeah. And sort of the harder it becomes for circus spaces to continue to exist as multidisciplinary spaces, right? How many spaces exist that are kind of monodisciplinary today versus 10 years ago, right? 10 years ago, so many of these spaces were multidisciplinary, and now we see, like, oh, we're seeing the pairings off of like, here is a space for aerial and pole fitness, right? Here is a space for yoga and partner acrobatics.
Look how you're partnering those words. Like, it's also that pairing off is, I don't know if it's like a pairing off or it's more like meiosis where like two different fields of practice kind of come together with circus, and circus keeps pairing off with other things. But I think that's a good, that part I like, because then it's not taken away from the original circus idea, and we're still here to strengthen and pollinate our values through circus into all these other, for me, that's what I'm seeing right now, is this explosion of like tentacles reaching out from circus everywhere.
And there's the thing, what I wonder about and what I get a little nervous about sometimes is something you just said, which is about the circus values, right? Is about like the values of social circus and the values of accessible teaching practice. As these disciplines, like you said, kind of tentacle off and branch off, and as these things become more accessible, do other pedagogies start to kind of like take over from those circus values? And you know, like I see this in aerial, at least, you know, like dance pedagogies of the toe must be pointed, the leg must be straight, the, you know, like if this is what an aerialist is supposed to look like.
Yeah, I've thought about this too, and I think that we are much more contagious than they are, because when you have this merger, you have them coming from a standardized model, and then circus brings in its, and it's sort of like it's evolution. It's whatever's going to produce the result. You know, the more they get in contact with us, the more they see the impacts.
Yeah.
You know, so they're able to then increase the quality of their services, and it goes that way. You know, because there is a money equation in this. You know, like you pointed out in your presentation, and there's an outcome. You can quantify to some extent. Each person can personally quantify what it is that they're gaining, and I'm going to go to the school that I feel is allowing me to gain more. And if that school integrates circus methodologies into it, so be it.
Right.
You know?
And I agree with you. I think the more accessible pedagogies will always involve and motivate more students. You know, like if you have a space that is only for hyper flexible dancer body types, then you're going to be a smaller school than a school that kind of can be accessible to everyone. And I feel like the same is probably true in object manipulation spaces, you know, that
For sure.
the more accessible options you have, the more ways there are to interact, the more students are able to interact. And I think this is an important thing.
Yeah, I think this is like not way for me why it's not a question of if, it's just when, because it's like math on paper now. It's like the programs that choose to adapt inclusivity will survive more, they will prosper more. And the programs who are not able to adapt will prosper less.
Yeah. I have a question from Tao in the chat around the possibility that this kind of nonlinear pedagogy and methodologies will kind of begin to take over from the linear, vertical, and traditional teaching. This is a really, I think, important question. I don't know where I would put my money at this moment. I think that the next kind of 10 to 20 years, there's a really important question that's going to be answered around, I don't know, I'm going to take a pretty big perspective here, around sedentary lifestyle and what my advisor for my master's calls movement suppressed culture. So it's pretty clear from a public health perspective that physical activity is really good for people. It's good for your physical health. It's good for your mental health. Active populations are healthier populations. And the huge thing that, you know, like in North America, insurance companies and that governments in public health sectors are seeing is the massive public and mental health effect of movement suppressed culture. And this is a problem that will come to a head in the next 10 to 20 years. If people on the whole continue to be as sedentary as we are, then we will see huge public and mental health outcomes from that, right? And so we will either kind of societally solve that problem or not. I think that one of the reasons we're seeing this movement suppression is this linear verticalist traditional pedagogical structure, which is honestly geared towards sport and competition. The Olympics have a huge role in this, and competitive sports have a huge role in this. And you know, this is kind of the slow weeding out of movement that happens in these spaces, right? One of my experiences as a circus coach and someone who kind of owns and runs a school is around 13, 14, we get this huge influx of kids who were in gymnastics programs who have become kind of homeless because their gymnastics program said you have to join team and come 5 days a week and spend all this money, or there's no more class for you. And that disenfranchises so many students from this sport, right? And then they're looking to continue moving, but if they don't have a circus school nearby, it's like, well, what do I do? You know, I'm a 14-year-old who's studied gymnastics my whole life. I'm not interested in soccer. I'm not interested in these sports. And the same thing happens with sport. The same thing happens with so many kind of types of movement, is slowly through adolescence, people get disenfranchised from it because they either aren't good enough to be on a team, or they don't want to be on a team, or they aren't interested in competition. This kind of non-linear style of learning and moving and what our spaces create present a solution to that. And getting that solution out into the world is something that actually quite a lot of people are invested in, right? A lot of physical education, like public school physical education, at least here in the United States, is really geared towards this idea. Over the next 10 to 20 years, I think we're actually going to see quite a lot of money poured into this problem, both from insurance companies and from public health departments of governments, because movement suppression has such wide-ranging health effects. And so there's a lot of money being poured into the research of this problem and how to insulate people against movement suppressed culture, right? And one of the things that we're finding really quickly doesn't work is this linear traditional style of teaching, right? Because it teaches too many people that movement is not for them, that they are not good enough to engage in physical activity, that because they cannot accomplish the like competitive or team level of skill, it means that they are not a physical person who should not move, right? And long-term, this is not a viable kind of solution from any perspective for me, but especially from the public health perspective is the one that I think is going to show an investment here. But also I think the next 10 to 20 years have a lot of big questions like that one that we kind of as a global society, as individual societies, are going to have to wrestle with. I think the question of movement suppression is part of a larger set of kind of social and cultural questions that are large and important. I hope I answered your question, pal. Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Yeah, cool.
I would like to share something interesting, what now revealed to me, that the only reason that I am now in circus and I am doing juggling is because I born with a heart disease. And because of that, I didn't get grade on PE lessons. So because of that, during my childhood, I didn't have to face the whole school system basically charging me with all this kind of need that I have to success, I have to be good, I have to be right in time. I just moved when I liked it. I participated all the PE lessons because I liked the move, I liked the good feeling, I liked the endorphin and all the stuff. I would wanted to be with the others. I was always weaker. I was always had problems with stamina and all this stuff. But fortunately, my self-confidence about my body was not ruined by the system. But I saw on many people who are all around me at the same age or even older or younger, that they are all doomed because of that. And that's a really clear explanation of how you put it in perspective, that why this system is not for the future. It's totally from the past, and we have to surface it somehow. And it's really funny to reveal that me, as a totally incompetent person, because I'm born with a really serious heart disease, I could survive, I could hack the system like this. But it's a really strange circumstance. And for people who don't have real heart issues also need this opportunity to not be part of the system. And it's really good that you cleared that. So thank you very much.
Yeah, what a cool and great example of sort of what I'm talking about. It's funny. There's some the research into this field has lots of different questions and lots of different solutions. There's some research that participating in kind of institutionalized school PE has actually negative long-term effects. But all school PE isn't created equal, you know? Like, we're not talking about all institutionalized PE is bad, right? Sometimes it's very good. And if I was to summarize at least what I've read to this point in my research, it's that physical education in school is, if it's bad PE, it has actually pretty intense negative effects. But good PE, right, has actually quite positive effects. And so it is indisputably a powerful tool. But it's kind of like when you have a drill, you know, like you have a power drill or a chainsaw. This is a powerful tool, and like, oh well, what are you doing with your chainsaw, right? Becomes the really important question. And so identifying what is it that makes good PE good, and what is it that makes bad PE bad, is a pretty critical question. And the equation for whether or not people value movement or see themselves as movement competent people is actually much more complex than what happens to them in school in PE. It is also a question of access in their community. It is also a question of social and cultural value. It is also a question of kind of like so many different pieces of the puzzle that lead to whether or not people are remaining active and engaging with movement throughout their lifetime or not, right? Those who can't do teach, and those who can't teach gym. Yeah, this is a really good, I should remember that quote and keep it, because it's a really good Woody Allen quote, right? And I think we're seeing that, right, in the kind of bad PE. And then the other side of it is, you know, people like the people here, or people like some of the PE teachers who I know and some of the researchers who I know, is like some of the best teachers want to teach movement, because we understand that teaching people how to be in their bodies and teaching people about flow state and how to problem solve in their body is critical for social change. You know, if you only know how to think about problem solving, but you don't know how to regulate your body or regulate your emotion or regulate your state when you're encountering a problem or a conflict, right? The only way we learn how to actually manage frustration and conflict is by being in frustration and conflict, right? If you're not exposed to those moments of like, I'm in a flow state, I'm going to do my impression of the juggle board. This is my juggle board, right? If I'm in a flow state and then there's a perturbation, right? There's a change. Oh, right? How do I react to that change? How do I reevaluate and re-enter flow state? That's an important physical practice, right? It's not just something you understand in your head and then can do. You have to have the body experience of it. Cool, that's our hour. I'm excited to get to talk about these things with you all. And thanks, Craig, for the opportunity. This was a great exercise for me. I am, like I said, still in the middle of pursuing my master's degree in my research, and hope to only get better at talking about these things. But it was nice to get an opportunity to summarize my work at this point.
We are all here for sharing, and we appreciate your contribution. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your conference, everyone.
Thanks, Adam.
Yep.
Cheers.
Cheers.